we're gonna go to my roomie. Me and this girl actually were roommates. This lady, we were actually roommates at Spelman College, my freshman roommate. And now she's a godmother to all my four babies. She is my other half outside of my husband. This is my best friend, Dr. Nakisha Rutledge, and well, she's going to hop on and she's going to tell you her story. And it's something that's also personal to me because, like I said, she means everything to me. She's a true blood sister. And, I'm gonna let her tell her story. But Keisha, Rumi, please hop on and just tell us your story and how it really impact your advocacy.
Yes, absolutely. First, I just want to say shout out to Mama Nija, okay? Because having a Black mama on deck is so important.
Mm.
Um, and you brought up a good point about making sure people know that you have somebody. So, other thing I want to say, thank you for making it to the other side of motherhood for all of y'all. Like it's such a scary journey to even be a part of. But I say that because you brought up a point about making sure people knew you had someone around. So for my first baby, I had him my second year of my PhD. I was in Chicago. I had no family. All I had was my partner at the time. His family was here, but we were still like I had met his parents, but hadn't met like the rest of his family or whatever. And his family's not nearly as big as my family is. And so I remember saying, okay, well, I want to go to one of these fancy hospitals because it's important because they have all the resources, the latest equipment, and I'm going to get a Black doctor, right? Because I thought I was thinking ahead. Well, sometimes in these spaces, Black doctors can get a little bit big-headed and think that they are above or they forget how we're treated. And I remember expressing concerns during my pregnancy. First, everyone treated me like I was a pregnant teenager because I looked really young and I was going to my appointments by myself. And it wasn't on purpose. It was just because where I was getting my PhD, there was a hospital attached to it. So I just scheduled my appointments that way. And I would tell her, like, hey, something's wrong. And she's like, oh, that's just because you're a first time. That's because you're young and like you don't know your body yet. This is normal. And so I said, okay. And every time I came into my appointment, my blood pressure was high. And she would say, oh, well, you're a graduate student, you're getting your PhD. Did you have an exam that day? And I would say yes, because sometimes that's kind of how I would schedule it after something so I could go home afterwards. And I let them convince me that that's what it was. In my family, because I was raised by my grandparents, they were always like, well, the doctor knows best. You always listen to the doctor. And so when I had him, um, I fired the Black doctor and I went with someone else who was listening to me a little bit better. She just so happened to not be on call the night I went into labor. And I remember getting in there and my blood pressure, I will never forget this number. It was 200 over 195. And the reason I say that is because people do not understand that that is severely high. And I remember crying. I remember they just gave me Pitocin and rolled me upstairs. And they were like, well, the Pitocin is going to lower your blood pressure. What are you crying for? Because your family's not here. You'll be okay. They had kicked my partner out the room. And I remember my nurse being really nasty towards me. And I needed like oxygen. Um, and then when it came time to push, the doctor was sitting on the edge of the bed the whole time, looking at her watch, sighing, huffing and puffing. And I had never seen this doctor before. And when I was pushing, I pulled a muscle and they weren't helping me push. So my partner was holding one side of me when he came back in the room, but the nurse was usually they will hold the other side of your body. She wasn't holding me. And I was like, can you help me? And she was like, it's your responsibility to pull yourself. And so for people who can't see me, I'm not that tall. My arms are not that long. And I couldn't do it. And so eventually they were like, well, you've been pushing for 2.5 hours. Your water had been broken for 12. You should get a C-section. And so they like, I asked my partner, he was like, well, they said he's sideways. And so I signed the papers. And I remember going into my C-section and I started convulsing. I don't know what they gave me. They weren't telling me what they were giving me. And I started shaking really bad. And I like was freaking out. And I was just like, oh, I'm shaking. I'm cold. This is what happens to people when they're dying. And my partner said immediately after I said that, I passed out. Whatever they put in my IV put me to sleep. And I remember waking up to hearing them say they snipped my bladder. And then my son wasn't breathing, but I didn't find out my son wasn't breathing until his first doctor's appointment. The pediatrician brought it up and said, hey, he wasn't breathing when he first was born. I looked at dad and I was like, what? And he was like, oh, yeah. And I was like, well, why didn't anyone say anything to me? And he was like, well, he started crying eventually. They told me it was nothing. They didn't want to freak you out. Mind you, after you get a C-section, you're in the hospital for a couple days. It was never mentioned. At this particular hospital, you have to walk around the corridor in order for you before you can leave. And I remember walking and getting really winded and crying. And that was the first time I was like, something's wrong. And they were like, no, it's just normal. You just had a baby. But they were neglectful the whole time. My partner was the one who bathed me and helped me to the restroom. I had completely soaked through everything. By the time my nurse came in for the first time, I don't even remember what time my son was born. That's how drugged I was until after I took all the paperwork home a week later. And I was like, oh, I didn't know. Um, so fast forward, my family comes to town finally. And I'm like, something's wrong. I can't breathe. I'm getting winded just sitting down. I could hear like liquid on my lungs. And my partner thought I was coming down with the flu. And so he was giving me tea. And then I called the doctor and I said, hey, I just had a baby. Something's wrong. I can't breathe. And they were like, oh, you just need to call your primary care physician because since you had your baby, you're no longer our patient. That's what that lady told me. And she hung up on me. Another day went by and I walked from my bedroom to the living room. At this time, that was in the far distance, and I just couldn't breathe. My family had left. So I told him, I said, you need to take me to the emergency room. We get to the emergency room. They thought I had pneumonia. So they were treating me for all of these things. Mind you, I'm breastfeeding. They gave me broad range antibiotics. They gave me two blood transfusions. They told me that my blood was so low. I was so anemic that had I waited another day that I would have went into shock. Eventually, when they rolled me back upstairs, they were like, oh, um, actually, it was because you had a baby. You were eclamptic. And I said, they didn't say anything else. They gave me blood pressure medicine, sent me on my way. Um, and I really think that happened because I was by myself. So the second go round, 8 years later, because I was so traumatized, I didn't want any more kids. Um, I was very intentional about where I had my child. The Spelman sisterhood is something that you have to experience in order for you to truly understand it. My Spelman sister was a labor and delivery nurse at a community-based hospital who saw primarily Black and brown people. And she had told me to be weary of teaching hospitals in Chicago because the students are so anxious to get hands-on experience that the doctors will sacrifice patient care in order for the students to have hands-on experience. So she convinced me to go to this community place. And when I walked in there, they didn't have resources. The beds you had to roll with your hand for up and down. Specimens were collected in paper cups. But when I say this was the one time that a doctor listened to everything I said, um, she respected the fact that I wanted a VBAC, and everything. And my pregnancy was still a little hectic. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that I had so many complications the first time. So I ended up having to get blood transfusions every week up until she was born. I ended up gestational diabetic, ended up preeclamptic again. And I was hospitalized again after my second baby. And I remember I kept going back and they would send me home to the point where I had to file a complaint with the nursing staff and some other doctors because my doctor was only there on certain days. And I remember the last time I went back, she was there and she was like, I'm not sending you home. And that night was still traumatizing because they stuck me 25 times. My body was in such a bad state that they couldn't get an accurate vein in order for them to gain access to give me the mag drip. And I ended up seizing. They ended up giving me Benadryl, and I like just slept the rest of the time. And so much so, like, I'm not having any more kids. And it's not that I can't, it's that the thought of me potentially not being here and leaving my other two kids behind scares me halfway to death. And so the difference between my first pregnancy and my second one, although I still ended up hospitalized and traumatized, I had people there to advocate. I had a doula. I had my friend who was a labor and delivery nurse at the hospital who was like, no, you can't eat. No, I'll do your IV. Here's, some things. And it's just really important for you to have those people in your life that can advocate for you to do the research. And I think it was Nancy who brought it up that sometimes those situations that you go through when you are having kids can cause long-term effects. Like to this day, my daughter's 2 now, and I'm still going to the doctor dealing with things that are a result of from me having her. Um, and so, that's just I'm thankful to be here. I'm thankful for my village and my friends. Don't always go for the fancier hospitals if I have to give someone something like the glitz and glams and the all of the prestige and the money. You can get overlooked there, even if you have a doctor of color. So just kind of really do your research and get the reviews because they're out there and those people aren't lying. And sometimes they will try to bury the reviews there as well.
Hmm. That's an interesting fact that you shared because we always look at, I want those high end, those, you know, higher quality hospitals when I deliver, but I know home birth's been something that also been really trending recently. Just kind of getting a pool and having somebody support you and family there. So I love that you made that point, but also looking at other ways
Mhm.
it's so that you feel safe to be able to deliver your baby at home at a hospital. I know they have other centers, birthing centers that you can go to as well that may not be actually in the hospital that can support. So thank you, Rumi. Thank you, sis, for like sharing your story and just really pouring to us. Because, like I mentioned, me and her have a deep relationship for years now, and it still just connects with me that she experienced that and she's right there next to me.
Mhm.
Like just scared on how it will look for her. And I know she's not the only one that has those stories. So again, the point is for us to pour into each other, to listen to each other's stories and say, hey, you know, Dr. Rutledge experienced this, Ashley experienced this. I may want to say this. I may want to bring this up when it comes down to my doctor's appointment or me planning to become or creating a family. So thank you for being vulnerable and just open about your experience.